it up. So let's jump back up to our add function. So now that we are we know that we've got a valid scene file. We're that far. Now let's start pulling out the information. So we want the show is either the asset show, or if it's not set, let's get the current show. And then let's also get the current show directory. Now, what is that function? That's a private function we made, or a protected function, because that's for our internal use. So we're going to jump down here into get show dir, and this returns the show directory, kind of similar to show dir property, but it also checks if it exists. If not, it makes it. So if it doesn't exist by joining, and what it does is you can give it a show. So if they gave it a show, we're going to join it with the current root directory and show. Otherwise, return the show dir. And then, so the idea here is we want it to, if we're referring to a show, we want it to make this directory if it doesn't exist. That's what we're getting at here. So if it doesn't exist, make it. If it couldn't make it, if this fails, this is how we catch errors. You wrap whatever code you want in a try except, and you say, if this fails, and if you were to try this, it will fail with an OS error. So we know we can look for the OS error, and anything else would be a different type of error. So you say try to make the directory. If it exceptions with an OS error, and it'll pass along the exception. We call our commands.error from the Python module for Maya to fail out and tell us it failed with trying to make this directory, and here was the error. Why? Maybe it's a permissions error. Maybe it's something on your file system you can't make it. So if that works, we keep going, and we need to make the images directory, and that's going to be the show directory plus the images. So it's going to make this directory right here. Let's go back over here. And it does the same thing. It tries to make it. If it can't make it, it's going to fail out. And finally, it's just going to return the show directory that it made. So let's jump back up to here. So that's how we get back up to here. We call this get show dir with the show of the asset to make sure the asset exists or the show exists, and we get D. So moving on, we're going to get our naming for the new file, and what we want to do is we want to name the file when it's imported the same as the scene name. So we're going to get the base name of asset scene, and that basically rips off the directory and just gives us back the file name. So that's the file name of the scene, and then we split it into the name and extension, and then we say, okay, the name is either the asset name, and if the asset name, so they can specify the name if they want in the asset. If the asset name is not set, then it will just use the scene name. You see how it's asset name or name. Then we go down here and we format the name back with the extension, and we join that back with the show directory. So we've now built a new destination file path that would look like this. So it will basically give us the path to this here. And we do the same thing with the image. We either take the image name, the image if they've given it to us, or the default image if they haven't specified an image. We rip out the extension by doing get the file name, split the extension, and then take the last item in the list, which is the extension. Then we join it back together with the new path. So we get we join it with the name, and then we join it with the path. So we end up with this right here. And the last thing we want to do is we just want to check if the asset already exists in the library. We're just going to fail out for now. You could do other things with it, but we're just going to say you can't import the same asset. So down here I'm using the shutil module, which has some extra functionality for copying files. So we're just going to say, okay, copy the asset into the destination, copy the image into the image directory, and then update the asset that was passed in with the new location. So if they set up the asset for the source location, it's now going to come back as the new asset location, and then we print the asset. Let's see how that actually works. Okay, so we're going to pull up this right here, and we're going to set up our path. Okay, let's make sure we set it to asset importer. Oops, let's make sure we run the whole code. And let's get rid of this here. And let's say import asset. We'll do from, because we're not going to keep reloading everything. Let's take a look here. So what we're going to do is we're going to say asset importer 2 will import the asset importer. Actually, we will just import the whole thing. So let's just say asset importer 2. Okay? Alright, so now that we've got that in, we've got the ability to make an asset. See? So let's make an asset. Let's say asset equals asset. And let's say the asset name, now let's take a look at what we want to add. Okay, let's go into our new assets location, and let's say we want to bring the chair into the scene. So let's go back over to Maya, and to make this a lot easier, let's just change our current directory. I'm going to import OS, like that, and I'm going to say os.change_dir, and we'll just change our directory so that we're right here, and we don't have to keep typing out full paths. You can do the same thing, whatever's local to you. So now, when I type out, we know we want the chair. So let's do the name, and if we didn't set this, it would call it chair. But let's say, let's call it new chair asset asset.scene equals, and we can do a relative path. So we can say it's new assets chair, new assets chair.mb, asset.image. Now if we didn't put an image, it would use our default PNG, but we do have an image. So let's just grab this and put that here and change it to PNG. And for the show, again, we could not set a show, it would go into the general show, but let's set a show, and let's call it the furniture show. Did I spell furniture right? Maybe. That's okay, we're not learning spelling right now. So we've got this, let's set all that, and what happens when we print our asset? Now see how nicely this prints? This says the name, the show, the scene, and the image, and this is all where our asset currently resides. And it prints that way because if we bring up our code and we go down to asset, we set the representation to print this way. So whenever it tries to get the representation of that file or this asset, you'll see this nice printout. And it's great when you have a list, as you'll see in just a minute. But so we printed that out. Now that we have it, we have our asset importer. Let's create the actual importer. We'll just call it I. Let's call it something short. Asset importer, and then that's the module, so we need importer. And as far as creating a new asset importer, we can give it a default show, and we can also be more verbose. Let's just not give it anything. Let's do everything default. So we've got a new asset importer. Now, in order to add that, let's check our code again. Let's check how we add something. All we have to do is give it the asset, and it will find out where to put it based on whether you set the show or not, or whether you have a default show. So if we say I add asset, and I want to pull up, let's see if we can see what's going to happen here. So we have our asset library, we have our two shows. Let's see if I can make some room. Like that. Okay. And let's see what's going to happen here. So if I add it, as you can see, it created our furniture show. I'm still skeptical of whether I spelled furniture right, but you can forgive me, I'm sure. And it brought over new chair asset and put the image in the image directory. And there's our chair, right? And what did it give us back? If we look at what this asset is, you can see that it modified the path. Now we're using relative things, so I mean this is still valid. It's just slightly bigger than it would need to be, but it definitely points at where the new asset is, where the new image is, the show. So now we have this valid asset. And what we can look at next, let's go back and look at our code. And we have this list function. And the list function can tell us all the assets that are in a given show. And the way we've set this up is it can take a name, it can take part of a name. See, specifying a name returns only assets whose name contains the pattern. And whether you want it to search all shows or just the current show. And the way we set the current show, if you remember, is just with the property. So let's go back to our list. Let's look at some of the code here. And it basically checks if we're looking at all shows, then it does a listing of the root directory and gets all the shows under it, builds up full paths of all the shows, and puts them in the directory list. So then we'll have a path to each one of these shows for it to look through. If you're not doing all shows, then just get the directory of the current show, and we'll put it in this list. Then we're going to loop over every directory that we want to look at, get the show name, get everything that's in that show name. We're going to ignore any hidden files that start with a period. We'll just continue. Join that item name with the full directory. We make sure that it's a file because we don't want to work on subdirectories. And if it is, we're going to split off the extension and get the name of the file. This is where we check if they set a name pattern up here. Then we say if name is set and the name is not in the item, continue, because we only want to match patterns, and that only happens if the name is set. And then we find the image. We get the name of the asset, and we attach it to the extension of the original image, and we build up a new asset object. You see we set the path, the name, the show, we join the image, and we add it to our asset list, and we return it. So let's see what happens in here. If I say i.list, and I'm not going to give it anything. Let's clear this up. I'm not going to give it any arguments. It's printing everything in the general show. We have 3 items in our general show. We got the palette, the ladder, the magnifying glass, and where they lead to. Now, that's because our current show is set to general. What if I say all shows? Now we've got every show. We've got the general show. We've got 2 items in the war. Or actually 3 items in the war. Is that 4 items? How many items we got in the war? And let's see. Here's our furniture, right? Let me clear this. Now, what if we just want to find everything that starts with mag? We know that we've got assets in there, and they start with mag. We're going to search all shows. We're going to say name equals mag, and it's going to say if that matches anywhere in the name. And if we had 5 different things, a magnum gun, you know, that kind of stuff, we would get all those assets. So we have a way to search for our assets. And if I said false on all shows, we get general. And we can change our show by saying I show equals war. Now what if we did this again? We get nothing because it's now checking the war show, and there's nothing in the war show that matches. So now we have this way to add, we have this way to list. What other functionality do we have? Well, we need a way to get those assets into Maya. So we have this other function called load, which takes an asset object or a string name, because since we are able to search by name, we might as well allow it to load by name as well. So you can either give it an asset name or you can give it an object. And the way we figure that out is we say if it's an instance of an asset, then the asset is the asset we gave it. If it's not, then list it first and get our assets. And then we have this print function, and this is just a little helper. Let's go down here. All we did was wrap this up. If we're in verbose mode, print, and that's just a flag from the init right here. So if you set this to verbose, you're going to get a lot more printing, and that's just a nice way so you can on one line do verbose printing. So what we do is we clear the selection list in the scene for each asset in the assets that we're going to load. What we're going to do, and this is kind of an interesting way to find out what's been loaded off the scene, and it's the only reason we're doing this is just to show more examples of what you can do with the code. But what we do first, we do an ls, and we try to find all assemblies, that being the top level node of any hierarchies that come in from our file. So we want to get the list of all of them in the scene before, and then we import our file, and I'm going to import it as a reference, and we set the namespace to be the asset name so that we don't get namespace clashes, and they come in with the asset name. And then we get the assembly list afterwards. And you notice I'm wrapping these in a set, and a set is a Python object that is like a list and a tuple, but it can only have unique items, and you can do some special stuff with set, so you can only have one of each kind of item in a set. So after that, I take my after set and I get the difference of the before set, and this gives me back everything that's different between the two, so I can see basically what assemblies just came in without having to worry about what the file command gives me back. I can just check the difference in the scene. So we say for every item in the new stuff that we get back, we're going to add attributes. And you remember earlier I showed you the attribute asset name, attribute show. Those were up here. You can see in the class level attributes. And we set these to asset name, asset show. Let's go back to load here. So what we're going to do is we're going to add attributes, string attributes, and we're going to set them to the name of the asset name and the name of the show. That way we're tagging our assets, and we could look them up later, and then we just print some more, and we select everything that was just imported. And so let's find out how that works. Alright, so we've got this asset right here, this chair. Let's import it. So we do i.load, and it could take a string or the asset name. Let's just pass it our asset object. I'm going to clear this list. And by the way, I'm just going to show you, we could turn verbose mode on, equals true, just if we want to see more printing. Okay, let's see what happens when we load this item. Alright, so it went in, it found the item. I'm going to close this for a second. We've got our chair, right? And what did, and you see it made the namespace the name of the asset. And if we look at the extra attributes on this top level node, we created an asset name, an asset show. We set it to the name and the show, and we could look this up again later since we have our listing. So we could end up finding every asset that's currently in the scene. And we might do that in a couple more steps here. Let's look at one more bit of code here. Now in the asset importer 3, we added one more thing. Let's close this up so we can see it. We added this function called find imported, because now that the last thing we did was we tagged our assets, it would be great to find them in the scene if we just loaded this up. If you handed me a scene that had assets in it and I had the asset importer, I could just use this method to find out what assets are in this scene. And what we do is it doesn't take any arguments. It returns a list of, it's a tuple. Each item in the list is first the string node name in the scene, and second the asset object that points to it on the file system. So first thing we do is we list all the transforms in the scene, because that's what we tagged, only transforms. This could be widely extended by anyone else later on, but for our purposes, we're just tagging the top level transform of the assembly. So we get the all the transforms in the scene, and then for every transform, we query the asset attribute name that we set. We see, does it exist on this node? If it doesn't exist, it's not one of our assets, so we continue. But if it does have our asset attribute, then we grab the name and we grab the show off the node. We set our show in our asset importer so that we're currently working on that current show. And we list that name that we just got to get the actual asset object. If it got an asset object, then we're going to grab the first one because our list command returns a list, so we're going to grab the first one off the list. Otherwise, we didn't find an asset for it. And then we append the node name and the value we got for the asset, and we return it. And let's see what we get over here. Let's go down here. Find imported. And all we have in the scene is the chair. Oh, look at that. No attribute find imported. That's because we're using asset importer 3 or 2. We need 3. So let's go over to our import. Now it's imported. Let's change this up to 3. Now we've got version 3 of asset importer. We'll just keep our verbose as true. And now we should have this function. And look what we get back. It found at this path, this is the node name of the asset in the scene, and it gave us back the asset object. And this is going to be really useful in our next part where we talk about wrapping a UI around this, because while it's great to get this functionality, you don't want to sit here and be typing all of this. It would be really great if we could actually wrap this up into a UI. So in this chapter of the video, I want to start talking about user interfaces and how we're going to start wrapping them around our code. And the first example we're going to look at is how to do it in the Maya UI using the built-in commands, the same way that this UI has been built up. And then we're going to show you some alternate ways using Qt, and eventually with PyQt, which is a little bit more of an advanced install, but I still want to show you the option. And I also want to address how I've been going about the code so far. I know it's been a lot of information, but I just want to show you a lot of examples that you can pause at any time and really just focus on. So I figured it's best to give you more information and let you take advantage of this being a digital video. Alright, so let's pull up some code here. And what I want to look at first is we have this asset importer win. And what we've got is a new class called asset importer win. And what we're going to do is import our asset importer module that does all the work, and we're going to wrap a UI around its functionality. And I'm going to explain everything along the way here. Now what I did was the way I'm referencing this, I set up code being the root, and then asset importer is a package, and you can tell it's a package because I've got the init file in here, which means that this should be treated like a package. So I can say from asset importer dot asset importer 3 import everything in there. And right now we're using asset importer 3. 4 will come at a step later. But what I do is, so we import the asset importer, and I'll explain this import in a second. We start our init with just some basic setup. We want to create an instance of our asset importer and save it as the importer attribute so that we can access it repeatedly. And I want to set some defaults, like a default window size, a default size for the icon, a default name for our window in Maya so that we can find it, and some other things that we're going to need, and I will describe that in a second. But next thing I like to do is create a show function, and this is different than the term show in the asset importer. This is actually like visually show, and this is where I like to put the code that actually builds the window and brings it into view. So we go into this show command, and the first thing it does is it calls this self.close. And what self.close is, let's jump down to that. That just says that it looks at the window and the default window name that we have, and it queries if it exists. If it does exist, it deletes it. So we're just going to simply say, if it's already visible, clear it, and let's just show a new one, just to be safe. You don't have to do it that way. You could show the existing window, but for our purposes, we'll just clear out the window. The next thing we do is we always start with a window command, and this creates a new window with the preferred name. The name could change, so what we do is we create the window and then save it into this variable so we can keep it. But this is the name we desire, and we set a title. The window is allowed to be resizable. It should not be retained when it's closed, meaning that if you close the window, it doesn't hide, it actually deletes. You could actually say true, and when you hide the window or close it, it's actually still there. You can show it again. And we set our default window size from up here. So we want a 1000 by 600 window. So then that creates our window, and we get the name of it in that window variable. These pop-ups are really killing me, aren't they? Okay, and then what we do next is we're going to create a layout. Now, working with the MyUI, it can be a lot of trial and error. And if you look at the commands for the form, and let's actually do that. Let's pull up our script editor here. I'm going to create a new tab, Python. Let's get some help and show the quick help. And let's say form layout. And actually, we should go to the documentation. Let's see if I can actually pull that up. Oop, it's big, isn't it? Let's now, if I go to the form layout, and we're in the MEL version, we actually want the Python version. Okay, now form layout can be very confusing. It's got a lot of options of how you can lay out everything, but what you can look at the bottom, if we scroll to the bottom here, you get these examples, and this is a really good way to find out what stuff does, is to just look at the layout examples. These are all runnable commands here. If I actually just take this and jump over here and paste it and run it, you get the form layout, and you can see how you can lay out one control and then controls that align with other controls or to the layout, and you can see how they are set to resize depending on how you actually attach them. So it's a real good way to play with the UI. It's a lot of trial and error I've found. So I'm going to move this off here, keep it for when we need it again. And let's hide this help. Now let's go back into here and look at the code. So we create a form layout, and we save the variable. And whenever you make a layout, you're now in the context of that layout. So any child items you make are going to be assumed to be a child of the previous layout. So now we make this button, and we're going to have, we want a button that can reload the library. Actually, I should probably just show you what this looks like, and then we can go over the context of the code. So let's change, I'm going to change my path. I'm just going to add this path from the code level, and I'm going to say import asset importer win, and what we want is the asset importer window. So let's say win equals asset importer win. To create that, win.show. Alright, we got a pretty big window here. Oh good, it fits right in there. Alright, so this is what we're going for. Right, we've got our title, asset importer, we've got this button that says refresh library on this side of the screen, and we've got the refresh imported on this side of the screen. So what we want in this list, in this view, is to get all of our assets so that we can actually import them. And in this list, we want to see everything that's been imported. And if I hit this now, It's pulling up all our assets, right? It's pulling them off of the asset location that we set earlier because we